Earth was outvoted at the Galactic Council, then everything changed. They did not warn us. That is the part that still burns, even now, more than 20 years later. They did not send a message. They did not call an emergency session and give us time to prepare. They simply added a new item to the agenda, buried it under 3 routine trade reviews, and waited for me to walk into the chamber without a clue about what was coming. My name is Yara Osei. In the year 2187, I was Earth's only representative to the Galactic Council. I had held that position for 6 years. I knew the chamber well. I knew where the ventilation clicked every 11 minutes. I knew which ambassadors fell asleep during the agricultural reports. I knew the smell of recycled air and old decisions and the particular silence that falls over 47 species when something important is about to happen. I did not know, when I walked through those doors, that the something important was us. The chamber was already full when I arrived. That was the first sign. Sessions rarely drew full attendance unless the topic was significant. I counted the seats as I crossed to my station, every ambassador present, some leaning forward, some deliberately not looking at me. The Kiriti delegation, 6 of them, sat rigid in their curved seats. The Veth ambassador, Councillor Sereth, caught my eye for one brief moment and then looked away. He was the closest thing I had to a friend on that council. When a friend cannot hold your gaze, you know something is wrong. The session opened normally. 2 trade reviews passed without discussion. The third item on the agenda never came up. Instead, the council chair, a Relthani named Ovas, ancient and slow-moving and absolutely precise in everything she did, raised one long finger and said, in the flat translation that the chamber system produced, that she wished to move directly to the special matter. I pulled up the full agenda on my panel. The special matter had no title. It had a number. Measure 7 Tau. I requested clarification. Ovas looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something slightly embarrassing and said that clarification would be provided during the presentation. A Veth scientist named Greth stepped to the central floor. She was young for a Veth, her pale skin smooth, her voice steady. She began with data. 17 slides worth of data. Humanity's military spending over 30 years. Our satellite deployments. Our weapons development programs. Our colonial activity on Mars and the Belt. Our research output in propulsion and energy. She presented it all in the flat, careful tone of someone reading a weather report, and the effect was devastating, because when you line it all up on one screen in a quiet room, humanity looks like something building towards something enormous, and she never once said what she thought that something was. She let the audience decide. That was the clever part. She handed 47 species the same set of facts and let their imaginations fill in the rest. Then Ovas read the measure aloud. Mandatory containment of the Sol system. Effective in 72 standard hours. No trade vessels. No communication lines. No travel. A network of council-operated beacons would enforce the boundary. Earth would be permitted to maintain its internal government. No one would interfere with life on the surface. We would simply be set aside. Quarantined. Like something that might be dangerous and was better kept separate until someone decided otherwise. The stated reason was this: humanity's accelerating development and unpredictable trajectory presented a statistical risk to galactic stability. Statistical risk. That is what they called us. Not a threat. Not an enemy. A probability. A number on a chart that made 44 species uncomfortable enough to cut us off from everything. I stood up before Ovas had finished speaking. I did not wait for the floor. I did not raise my hand. I stood up and I said, loudly and clearly, that Earth had the right to speak before any vote was taken on any measure that directly concerned our species. The chamber went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of routine business. The sharp, held breath quiet of people surprised. Ovas looked at me for a long moment. Then she said I would be given the minimum courtesy allotted to member species. 90 seconds. I had 90 seconds to speak for 8 billion people. I did not argue the data. I had no counter-data prepared because I had not known this was coming. I could not stand there and dispute their charts with charts of my own. So I did not try. Instead I said this: we are a species that has spent our entire history making things. We made fire. We made language. We made music that made us cry even when we did not understand why. We made cities and tore them down and built them again. We have been hurt by each other in ways that are difficult to look at directly, and we have also, in those same years, produced kindness so ordinary and so constant that no one bothers to record it because it is simply what people do. We are not finished. We are not safe in the way that a still pond is safe. We are more like a river. We move. We change direction. We carve new paths. And yes, sometimes we flood. But you do not drain a river because it might flood. You learn its patterns. You build with it. I had 14 seconds left when I stopped speaking. The vote was called. I watched it happen in real time on my panel. Each ambassador's marker moving from neutral to yes. One by one. 44 green lights in a row. Then the session ended and the measure was entered into the official record and 2 council security officers appeared at my elbow to escort me from the chamber, politely and without any pressure, because they were professionals and this was not personal. Sareth was standing near the exit. He spoke quietly, barely moving his mouth. He said he was sorry. He said that 44 species had voted because they were afraid of us. He said I should consider what that meant. I walked to my ship alone. I sat in the pilot's seat for a long time before I moved. Outside the view screen, the station lights were steady and cold and indifferent. Somewhere out there, the quarantine beacons were already being prepared for deployment. In 72 hours, the boundary would close. I thought about Sareth's words. 44 species. Afraid. Of us. Of a planet that had just been given 90 seconds to defend itself. I opened a transmission to Earth. I kept it short. I said, they voted us out. Start the clock. Then I set my heading for home and pushed the throttle forward and did not look back. I cried once, somewhere in the middle of the journey, not from shame and not from grief, but from a sudden and absolute certainty that had settled into my chest like stone. We were going to be all right. I knew it because I was already angry enough to prove them wrong. And humans who get that angry tend to build things. The message reached Earth 14 minutes before I did. By the time my ship touched down at the Nairobi hub, the contingency office already existed on paper. The Secretary General had signed the authorization order in the time it took me to clear the atmosphere. People keep asking me when I knew it would work. They want a moment. A flashpoint. Something cinematic to point to. The truth is there was no moment like that in those first hours. There was only the particular quality of silence in the room when I walked through the door of the emergency session and saw who was already there. They had not called generals. They had called a geologist named Colin Price who had spent 12 years mapping Europa. They had called a linguist named Florence Adler who had learned 4 galactic languages in 3 years without the help of a translation implant. They had called a doctor named Leon Okafor who ran a clinic in Lagos on a budget that would make most galactic health administrators laugh. They had called a young mathematician named Alice Webb who had published, at age 24, a paper on quantum navigation that 2 VETH institutes had quietly dismissed as too unconventional to be useful. I sat down. I looked around the table. I said, they gave us 72 hours before the boundary closes. Let's talk about what we do next. What followed was not a speech. It was not a plan presented by a committee. It was a conversation that lasted 11 hours, during which no one left the room for anything except urgent biological necessity, and during which the scope of what we were attempting to do became slowly, clearly, and somewhat terrifyingly real. The council had quarantined us because they expected isolation to weaken us. They had done the math on our trade dependencies. They had calculated how much of our energy infrastructure relied on galactic imports, how much of our advanced medical technology was built on VETH designs, how much of our faster-than-light communication network depended on council relay stations. They had concluded, correctly, that cutting those threads would hurt. What they had not calculated, because it was not in their models, was what humans do when something hurts. We get up. The first year was the hardest. I will not pretend otherwise. The energy shortfalls were real. Certain medical supply chains collapsed. 3 major galactic research partnerships dissolved overnight, and those partnerships had been funding work that could not simply be paused and resumed. There were protests. There was anger directed at the council, at me, at the government, at anyone visible enough to be a target. I understood it. I accepted it. I kept working. What saved us, in that first year, was not a single decision. It was the refusal to stop making decisions. Leon set up medical supply networks between clinics on 4 continents that, within 8 months, were producing locally synthesized versions of 6 medications that had previously been imported. They were not perfect. They were good enough, and then, month by month, they got better. Florence trained translation teams that could communicate in Veth and Kiriti and 2 other council languages without machine assistance. Not because we needed to communicate outside the boundary, we could not, but because she said, and she was right, that you should never let a skill atrophy just because you currently have no use for it. Colin was the one who found the fusion solution. He had been working on energy generation theory as a side project for 3 years, a private interest that no one had funded because galactic fusion technology was considered solved and importing it was cheaper than developing our own. In year 2 of the quarantine, with the Council's energy exports cut off, Colin's side project became the most important piece of research on the planet. He was given a team of 40 people and resources he had never had in his career, and within 14 months he cracked the core problem that had been stalling independent human fusion development for a generation. He did it differently than the galactic standard method. Not better, not worse. Different. Because he had learned it from scratch without any Veth textbooks to constrain his thinking. That difference would matter later. That difference would become one of the most valuable things humanity had ever produced. But in the moment, in year 2, what mattered was that the light stayed on. Alice's contribution came in year 4, and it came from a direction no one expected. She had been given access to the quarantine beacon network signal data, not because anyone thought she could do anything useful with it, but because she had asked and there was no good reason to say no. She spent 5 months staring at the mathematics of how the beacons communicated with each other, and then she called me at 2 in the morning and said, very calmly, that she had found something. The beacons had a flaw. Not in their containment function, they worked perfectly for that. The flaw was in their administrative layer, the layer that allowed council technicians to modify and update the network remotely. That layer had been built with a backdoor access protocol. A hidden emergency channel. It was not designed for humans to use. It was designed for council engineers, in case the quarantine ever needed to end quickly and they needed to shut the beacons down from a distance without sending a physical team. Alice had found it. Alice had read it. Alice had mapped every node in the network using it. She looked at me across the call and said, "We can leave whenever we want." I sat with that for a long time. I asked her how long it had taken to find it. She said 14 months from first contact with the data. I asked her how long it would take a council engineer to realize we had found it. She said they would probably never know unless we used it. I told her to document everything, encrypt the files, and bring the full report to me in the morning. Then I told her not to use it. She did not argue. She understood. The council had voted to quarantine us and we had agreed, in our own way, to stay, because the quarantine was built on fear, and the answer to fear is not escape. The answer to fear is proof. Proof takes time. We had time. Year 5 brought grief alongside progress. My mother, Amma, had a condition called systemic neural decay. It is rare. In the galactic medical system, it is also very treatable. There are 3 standard interventions, all of them developed by Veth researchers, all of them effective in over 90% of cases. Before the quarantine, she had been on a waiting list for one of those interventions. The list was long because access was expensive and the treatment required equipment that Earth had to import. The quarantine closed that door. Leon's team worked on her case personally. They tried 4 different approaches. They kept working until there was nothing left to try. I was with her at the end. She was tired but not afraid, which is the most I can say about any of us in those years. I wrote in my journal that night, they voted to protect the galaxy from us. They did not stop to ask what they were protecting us from. I did not write it as an accusation. I wrote it as a question. A real one. What were they protecting us from? Progress. Our speed. Our refusal to slow down and be manageable. My mother was not dangerous. She was a retired schoolteacher who had spent 40 years making sure children in Accra could read. She was one of 8 billion people who had been quietly set aside because 44 species looked at our charts and got scared. I kept that question with me. It did not make me smaller. It made me more certain of what I was doing. By year 6, Leon's team had developed, from scratch, cures for 3 conditions that galactic medicine had classified as low priority because they were rare outside of Earth. Rare outside of Earth. Meaning millions of humans lived with them, but because those millions were only a small fraction of the total galactic population, no one had invested the resources to fix them. We fixed them ourselves. In isolation. With no outside help. And we did it faster than any galactic institution would have, because we had a reason to. By year 7, Alice had used the beacon backdoor data to develop a navigation framework. She never used the backdoor itself, only the mathematical principles she had extracted from studying its structure, that allowed our own ships to move through the solar system with a precision that surprised even our most experienced pilots. She had reverse-engineered, from theory alone, a spatial mapping method that the Council had developed over 2 centuries of accumulated research. It took her 3 years. By year 8, we had fusion power. We had new medicine. We had propulsion principles no one outside our solar system knew existed. We had a translation core that could work in 4 galactic languages. We had Alice's navigation framework. We had 42 active research teams working on problems that had never been problems before the quarantine and were now close to being solved. And we had, still unused, the knowledge of how to leave whenever we chose. I stood at the observation window of the station above the Pacific on the last day of year 8 and I looked out at Earth below me, at the clouds and the dark water and the bright scattered lights of the cities, and I thought about what Sareth had said to me 9 years ago. 44 species were afraid of you. Consider what that means. I had considered it every day for 8 years. What I had concluded was this: they were afraid because we were moving fast and they could not predict where we were going. They were afraid of the unknown shape of us. And that fear was understandable, and it was also wrong, and the best way to correct it was not to argue but to show. We were ready to show. A Veth scout vessel crossed the boundary 18 days later. It came alone. It moved slowly, the way you move when you want to be seen clearly and not mistaken for something threatening. It dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, near the outermost beacon ring, and it sent a standard identification signal. Its sensors lit up immediately. There was traffic in the system that had not been there 8 years ago. Ships. Human ships. Moving between Earth and Mars and the Belt and the 2 new stations near Jupiter that had been completed in year 7. The scout had come expecting a quiet system, perhaps a struggling one, perhaps a desperate one. What it found was a system that had been busy. I was 3 hours away from Earth when the alert came through. I was aboard our first fully self-built deep space vessel. We had named her the ISV Contingency, which Colin said was too on the nose and Florence said was exactly right. She had been in service for 4 months. She was not as fast as a Veth cruiser. She was not as large. She was, in every way that did not matter, less impressive than almost any ship the Council operated. In every way that did matter, she was extraordinary. Because she had been built by people with nothing to prove and everything to show. I changed course immediately. I put on my formal jacket, the one I had worn to the chamber 9 years ago, kept pressed and ready in my cabin because I had always known this day would come, and I called the scout ship on their own frequency, in Veth, with a fluency that I had spent 8 years maintaining. I introduced myself. I gave my name and my title and the name of my vessel. I told the scout ship's commander to hold position. I told him we were coming to him. The response took 40 seconds. Then a young voice came through, careful and measured, identifying himself as Commander Liam Tivon of the Veth Science Directorate. He confirmed he would hold position. He sounded steady. But I had been an ambassador long enough to hear the thing underneath the steadiness. He was unsettled. Not frightened. Unsettled. The way you feel when something does not match what you prepared for. Good, I thought. That means he is paying attention. We docked with the scout vessel 2 hours and 40 minutes later. I brought 4 people with me. Colin, for the engineering questions that would inevitably come. Florence, for the language and the tone. Alice, because if they had brought any physicists she would enjoy the conversation. And my pilot, a young man named Patrick Derry, who had a quality I valued above almost everything else, he knew when to be quiet. Tivon met us at the docking seal. He was younger than I expected. Mid-30s by Veth standards, which put him well into professional maturity, but young enough that he had been a student when the quarantine vote happened. He had known Earth as an absence, not a presence. He had grown up in a galaxy where the Sol system was a closed door. He looked at us the way people look at something they have only read about. I extended my hand. He hesitated for only a moment, then took it. The handshake is not a universal gesture, but the Veth know it. They learned it from us, in the early years of contact, and some of them adopted it because they said it conveyed something their own greeting forms did not. The willingness to close distance. I said, "Thank you for coming to us." He said, "I was not certain what I would find." I said, "I know. Come inside. We have made tea." He did not know what tea was. Florence explained it on the way to the common room. Patrick had already set 4 cups on the table and put the kettle on, because Patrick understood the principle that small human rituals have a way of changing the temperature of a room. We sat down. Tivon asked his questions carefully. How many ships were operational in the system? What were the stations near Jupiter? What was the purpose of the large installation on the far side of the belt? Was the fusion signature our sensors are reading correctly calibrated? I answered every question. Openly and completely. No hesitation. No deflection. The installation near the belt was a research facility. The Jupiter stations were a combination of fuel processing and long-range observation. The fusion signature was correct. Earth had solved independent fusion generation in year 2. Tivon stopped writing notes at that point. He looked up from his panel. I said, "Is there something you want to ask that is not on your official list?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The council expected the quarantine to constrain you." He did not phrase it as a question. I said, "I know what they expected." He looked at the cups of tea on the table. He looked at Florence, who was listening with the calm patience of someone who has translated across very large distances. He looked at Colin, who was quietly drinking his tea and watching Tivon the way a man watches something he finds genuinely interesting. Then he looked back at me. He said, "Has the Council's threat assessment of humanity changed?" I said, "I don't know." "Has it?" He said he could not answer that. He said he would transmit his report when he returned to the boundary. He said the data he had collected today would reach Council Station in 3 days. I said, "Good. We will wait." He started to gather his notes. Then he stopped. He said, and I could tell this was not on his list, that he had one more question. He said, "You found the backdoor in the beacon network." It was not a question. The data Alice had compiled was detailed enough that a careful reader could see the shape of our access, even if they could not prove the method. I said, "Yes." He said, "You did not use it." I said, "No." He thought about that for a long moment. Then he said, "Why?" I looked at him across the table. I looked at this young Veth commander who had grown up in a galaxy where Earth was a cautionary note in a policy document and who had come to us expecting diminishment and found something he did not have a category for. I said, "Because leaving was not the point. The point was to show you who we are. You cannot see that from outside the boundary. You have to come in." He left 4 hours later. He shook my hand again at the docking seal, without hesitating this time. I watched his ship pull away and begin its turn toward the boundary. Patrick appeared at my shoulder and asked if I was worried about what came next. I said no. I said I was curious. He nodded. He said, "That sounds right." It did. We had 8 years of silence and we used them well, and now the galaxy was going to find out, and I was not afraid of that. I had been afraid once, in a chamber with 90 seconds on the clock and 44 green lights going on in a row, and I had carried that fear all the way home and put it to work. Fear is fuel. It burns and then it is gone, and what is left, if you have been careful, is something much more durable. I went back inside. Florence had made more tea. Colin was already pulling up the Jupiter station specs to review before the council response arrived. Alice was reading something on her panel with the particular focused stillness of a person who has found something interesting. I sat down. 3 days, I thought. Let's see. The invitation came not as a summons. That was the first difference I noticed. In 2187, they had scheduled a session and simply added our fate to the agenda without telling us. In 2196, a formal message arrived at the contingency office, addressed to me by name, on official council stationery, using the correct form of address for a serving ambassador of a member species. It requested my presence at Orbital Station Concord at my earliest convenience, for a full council session regarding the review of Measure 7 Tau. My earliest convenience. 9 years ago they gave us 72 hours. Now they were working around my schedule. I read the invitation 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Colin and Florence and Alice with a single line: we should talk about what we wear. Florence sent back a one-word response: everything. We left Earth 6 days later. I had spent those 6 days doing 3 things: sleeping properly for the first time in months, preparing the presentation I would deliver to the Council, and reading every document in our archive related to the Council's internal governance structure. I read voting procedures. I read session protocols. I read the rules about floor time and procedural amendments. I read the rules about membership classification and permanent seats. Florence watched me reading one evening and said, "You are building something, aren't you?" I said, "I am always building something." She said, "This time it is bigger." I said, "Yes." The journey to Concord took 11 days. The ISV contingency was not the fastest ship in the system, but she was reliable and she was ours, and I would not have taken any other vessel. When we docked at Concord Station, a junior council administrative officer was waiting at the seal. She had been sent to escort me to my assigned quarters. She was a young Rilthani, pale-feathered and efficient. She moved at the quick, precise pace of someone who had been trained to show respect through promptness. As she walked me through the station corridors, I noticed that other species gave us more space than they had 9 years ago. Not a great deal of space. Just enough. The kind of extra room you give something when you are not entirely certain of its dimensions. Good. That was an improvement. The council chamber looked exactly the same. That was the thing about very old institutions. They do not redecorate. The same curved tiers of seats, the same central floor where speakers stood, the same atmospheric mix that always smelled faintly of something I could never identify, the same lighting that was somehow both bright and soft. I stood in the doorway for a moment and let myself feel how strange it was to be back. Then I walked to my station and sat down. Every seat was full. Same as last time. Full attendance for the same reason as last time, except that last time the room's attention had the quality of a verdict and this time it had the quality of a question. They were looking at me the way you look at something that surprised you. Not with warmth, not yet, but with the open, evaluating attention of people who have revised their expectations and are not entirely sure how far to revise. Ova's was still chair. She was older, which for a Rilthani meant almost no visible change, just a slightly slower pace in her movements. She called the session to order and immediately gave me the floor. Not 90 seconds. She said I could have as long as I needed. I stood up. I looked around the room. I looked at Sereth, who was watching me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Something careful and hopeful at the same time. I looked at the Kiriti delegation, who sat as rigid as ever. I looked at the young Veth ambassadors who had replaced some of the older ones and who had only ever known Earth as an absence. I said, I would like to begin with something I believe needs to be stated clearly. 8 years ago, this council voted to quarantine Earth because our development made you uncomfortable. You looked at our progress and you saw risk. That response was understandable. It was also wrong. Not morally wrong, though I have thoughts about that too, but practically wrong. Because you assumed that isolation would slow us down. You assumed that removing access to galactic resources would reduce our capacity. You assumed that we would spend those 8 years struggling to maintain what we had instead of building what we did not. I paused. The room was completely still. I said, I would like to show you what we built. I did not gloat. That was the decision I had made on the way to Concord, and it was the hardest decision I have ever made. I had every reason to stand in that room and make each one of them feel the weight of what the quarantine had cost us. I had every reason to put my mother's face on that screen. I had every reason to make them small. I chose not to. Not because I had forgiven the vote. I had not. I chose not to because the point was not their guilt. The point was the future, and the future required them to be useful rather than ashamed. I presented the fusion data. Colin had prepared the full technical documentation, and I walked them through the core innovation, the way our engineers had approached the problem from a completely different direction, unconstrained by existing galactic theory, and arrived at a solution that worked differently from the standard method but solved two problems the standard method had not. A quiet murmur moved through the room when they understood what they were looking at. The VETH technical representatives were already making notes. I presented the medical data. The 3 conditions cured. The supply network Leon had built. The locally synthesized medications that were now more effective than the imported versions they had replaced because Leon's team had optimized for specifically human biology rather than adapting drugs designed for broader galactic populations. I presented Alice's navigation framework. I let her speak to that section herself, because she understood it better than anyone alive and because watching a 29-year-old human mathematician explain a 3-year theoretical project to 2 centuries worth of accumulated galactic physics expertise was, I will admit, one of my favorite moments in that entire session. There was a longer silence after Alice sat down. Then I presented the last item. I said, 8 months into the quarantine, one of our researchers discovered the emergency access protocol in your beacon network. She studied it for 14 months and extracted from it a navigation framework that became the foundation of our own spatial mapping system. At no point did she use the access protocol itself. She documented everything she found. The complete record, unmodified, is on the data card I am about to place on the central floor. I walked to the floor and set the card down and walked back to my station. I said, we could have left the quarantine at any point from year 2 onward. We chose not to. We chose to remain inside the boundary because the Council had the right to be concerned, and we believed the correct response to concern was proof, not defiance. Here is the proof. The room was silent for a long time. Then Sereth spoke. He moved to the floor with the measured pace of a man carrying something carefully. He said that he wished to table a motion. He said he moved to formally repeal Measure 7 Tau and restore Earth's full membership in the Galactic Council, without conditions. The vote was called. I watched the panel. Every marker moved. Every single one. 47 green lights in a row, including the 6 from the Kiriti delegation who had been among the loudest voices for the quarantine 9 years ago. Unanimous. I sat very still for a moment and breathed. Then I stood up again. The room had relaxed, a little, the way a room relaxes when a difficult thing is over. Several ambassadors had begun to move, assuming the session was concluding. Ovas had not called the session closed, which meant technically the floor was still mine. I said, if I may, I would like to table one further matter. The room settled again. Ovas inclined her head. I said, this council voted 44-1 to quarantine a species without giving that species adequate notice or preparation time. I am not raising this to revisit the vote. The vote is over. I am raising it because the process that produced that vote has a structural problem, and I believe that problem puts every member species at risk, not only Earth. I reached into my document bag and placed a second data card on the floor next to the first one. I said, I have spent 8 years studying the Council's governance structure. I have read the founding charter, all 217 amendments, the procedural records of every session since the Council's formation, and the decision-making patterns of every major vote in its history. I have identified 11 specific points at which the Council's current procedures allow fear to override deliberation. I have proposed amendments for each of those points. The document on this card contains 40 pages of detailed recommendations, with supporting data and implementation timelines. I stood up straight. I said, I am not presenting this as a grievance. I am presenting this as a gift. Because I believe this institution is worth improving and I believe Earth has something useful to contribute to that improvement. The silence that followed was different from any silence I had heard in that chamber. It was the silence of 47 species doing rapid and complicated thinking all at once. Then the Kiriti ambassador, the most senior one, who had not spoken once in the entire session, made a sound that took me a moment to identify. It was laughter. Not mocking. Not surprised. The deep, rolling laugh of someone who has just encountered something that genuinely pleased them. He said, in perfect galactic standard, that in 400 years of serving on this council he had never seen a species handed back its freedom and immediately used the moment to try to fix the building. The room, very slowly, began to laugh with him. I let it go on for a moment. Then I said, "We are human. It is what we do." Sereth was smiling when I looked at him. The kind of smile you wear when you have been waiting for something for a long time and it has finally arrived. I sat down. The session continued for another 3 hours. The governance document was formally accepted into the council record for review. A working group was formed. 2 VETH ambassadors requested copies of Alice's navigation framework before the session ended. The Kiriti delegation asked for a meeting the following morning to discuss the medical data. I walked out of the chamber that evening and stood in the corridor outside and pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes and breathed. Colin appeared at my side a minute later. He said, "How are you?" I said, "I am very tired." He said, "I know." He stood there with me for a while without saying anything else, which was exactly what I needed. Florence found us 5 minutes later. She said the VETH technical team wanted to schedule a preliminary meeting about the fusion data. Alice had already agreed to a follow-up session on the navigation framework for the day after next. I said, "Tell them yes to both." Then I said I was going to sleep. I did not tell them what I was thinking, which was that 9 years ago I had walked out of this chamber with an escort at my elbows and an empty solar system waiting for me. Now I had walked out alone, and 2 delegations had already asked for meetings, and somewhere on the central floor there was a data card with 40 pages of governance recommendations that a council working group was going to spend the next year arguing about. I had spent 9 years preparing for a fight. I walked into the chamber and offered them something better. Something they had not expected from us. Something they perhaps should have. It is a long time ago now. I am 63 years old as I stand in this room in Nairobi, looking at 34 young faces, and I am aware that some of you were not yet born when the quarantine vote happened and some of you were too young to remember it. You grew up in a world where Earth has a permanent seat on the council. Where the governance amendments I tabled in 2196 have been adopted, slowly and with a great deal of argument, across the following decade. Where the fusion technology Colin's team developed is now used by 11 species on 42 worlds. Where the navigation framework Alice built from first principles, from nothing but mathematics and 8 years of careful thought, is the basis of a navigational standard that carries 600,000 galactic flights a year. You grew up in that world as though it had always existed. It did not always exist. I want you to understand that. Not because you should feel grateful, though gratitude is a reasonable response to good fortune. I want you to understand it because you are about to walk out of this building and take your first postings off-world, and you are going to encounter species and situations and decisions that feel impossible, and I want you to know what you are made of before you go. So I will tell you what I have never said in a formal address. I will tell you the private version. The morning after the quarantine vote, before I sent the message home, I sat in my ship for a long time. The lights of Concord Station were outside the view screen, steady and cold. My hands were in my lap. I was very still. And then, quietly, and without any particular drama, I cried. Not from shame. Not from anger. From relief. From the strange, piercing certainty that settled into my chest like something finding its right place. We were going to be all right. Not because I had a plan. I did not have a plan yet. Because of what I had seen in the chamber. 44 species afraid of us. Not dismissive. Not contemptuous. Afraid. You do not quarantine something weak. You quarantine something you respect enough to fear. They had looked at us and seen something that moved too fast and grew too quickly and refused to be predictable, and they had been frightened, and their response to that fright was the quarantine, which was the wrong response but also, in its way, a kind of compliment. They had taken us seriously enough to act. And we were going to take that seriously enough to respond. My mother used to say that the hardest thing in any situation is to see it clearly. Not optimistically. Not with fear. Clearly. She said that most mistakes are made by people who are either too hopeful or too frightened to see what is actually in front of them. She spent 40 years teaching children to read, which meant she spent 40 years teaching them the same skill in a different form: look at the thing. Look at it without wanting it to be something else. Then decide what to do. I tried to do that for 8 years. The quarantine hurt. I will not minimize that. The energy shortfalls were real. The medical losses were real. My mother's death was real. There were days in year 3 and year 4 when I sat in the contingency office late at night reading situation reports and felt a heaviness that was not quite despair but was its close neighbor. There were days when I questioned whether we were moving fast enough, whether the approach was right, whether I had made errors I could not see. On those days I would walk. I had a route through the corridors of the office that took about 40 minutes if I did not stop. I would walk it and think. And somewhere in the middle of the walk, usually, something would shift. Not a solution. Not a plan. Just the understanding that the work was continuing, that people all over the world were doing extraordinary things in ordinary conditions, and that my job was to keep the conditions as stable as possible so they could keep doing it. That was all leadership was, most of the time. Not vision. Not speeches. Just keeping the conditions stable enough for extraordinary people to do what extraordinary people do. Colin cracked fusion because someone gave him 40 people and left him alone. Leon cured 3 diseases because someone made sure his supply lines stayed functional. Alice mapped the beacon network because someone said yes when she asked for access to the data and then did not check on her for 5 months because she did not need to be checked on. I was the someone in each of those cases. That was my contribution. It is not a glamorous contribution. It does not make for dramatic storytelling. But it was real and it mattered, and I want you to know it, because most of you will spend most of your careers being the someone rather than being the one whose name goes on the breakthrough. Both roles are necessary. Neither is lesser. The year after the quarantine ended, Councillor Sereth retired from the council. He had served for 51 years. He did not announce it publicly. He simply stopped attending sessions and sent a quiet note to the Secretariat. I found out through Florence, who heard it from a contact in the VETH administrative office. I sent him a message. I told him I was sorry to hear he was stepping back. I told him I remembered what he had said at the chamber door in 2187, and that his words had mattered more than he probably knew. He responded 3 weeks later. He said he was living in a quiet region of the VETH home world, near water, which he had always wanted. He said he had followed Earth's progress throughout the quarantine with a combination of concern and something he eventually identified as pride, which he found strange since he had voted for the measure. He said that watching us was the most educational experience of his long career. Then he said he was planning to visit Earth. He arrived 6 months later. He came alone, without staff, without any official notice. Florence picked him up from the arrival port because she happened to be the one I called when I needed something handled well without any fuss. She brought him to Nairobi on a commercial flight, and he sat in the window seat and looked at the clouds for most of the journey. I met them at my house. I made dinner, which was an act of considerable ambition on my part, and it turned out reasonably well. We sat on the terrace and ate and talked for several hours. He had questions about the fusion development. He had questions about Alice's work. He asked about Leon's clinic. He was, underneath the formal VETH manner, genuinely curious in the way that old people sometimes are when they have decided that curiosity is more valuable than maintaining appearances. After dinner, we walked. It was evening, warm, and the city was moving around us in the way that cities move in the evening, people returning from work, vendors packing up, children being called in, the sound of music from open windows. We went through the market near my neighborhood. It is loud there. It is full of color and argument and the particular energy of a place where a great many people are doing a great many things at once. Sereth stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the path and looked at the market. At the people. At the noise and the food and the motion and the life of it. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, "This is what we were afraid of." I waited. He said, "I understand now that we were afraid of the wrong thing." I did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He had arrived at something true on his own, and the correct response to that was silence. We walked back to the house. He stayed 2 more days. On the last morning he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He had decided he liked tea, and he looked at me across the table and he said, "What do you think would have happened if the vote had gone differently in 2187? If the measure had failed?" I thought about it. I said, "I think we would have continued developing at the pace we were going." I think some of the breakthroughs would have happened eventually, but more slowly, because we would have had galactic resources to lean on and we would have leaned on them. I think the governance amendments would never have been proposed because I would not have had 8 years to study the charter. I think Collins' fusion approach would have taken 30 more years because the galactic standard method would have been available and no one would have bothered looking for a different solution to a problem that already had an answer. Sarith said, "So the quarantine made you stronger." I said, "The quarantine made us ourselves." Stronger is one word for it. He considered that. Then he said, "And if we had known that would happen, do you think we would still have voted yes?" I looked at him. I said, "Honestly, I think you might have voted yes faster." He was quiet for a moment. Then he made that sound again, the same sound the Kiriti ambassador had made in the chamber, the deep rolling sound of genuine amusement. He laughed until his eyes were bright. I laughed with him. Now I look at you, all 34 of you, and I think about what I want you to carry with you when you walk out of this room. Not pride. Pride is fine, but pride is not useful on its own. Not anger, though anger, as I said, is fuel. Not even confidence, though you should have it, because you have earned it. What I want you to carry is clarity. Look at what is in front of you. Look at it without hoping it will be something else. Look at the difficult situation and find the one thing in it that is useful and build from there. That is all we did. That is all any of us ever does. We looked at the thing clearly and we built from where we were. You are going to go to worlds where you are underestimated. It will happen. You are human, which means you are fast and strange and sometimes alarming to species that have not spent enough time with us. Some of them will be polite about it. Some of them will not. Some of them will make decisions about you before they have asked you a single question. Let them. Then show them. Not with speeches. Not with arguments. Show them what you have built. Show them what you are working on. Show them the particular human habit of fixing a problem by building something new instead of waiting for someone else to fix it. That habit is not charming to all species. Some find it exhausting. Most, eventually, find it valuable. You are representatives of Earth. You are also just people, going somewhere interesting, working on something real. Hold both of those things at the same time. The formal role and the personal truth. The ambassador and the person. They are not in conflict. They are the same thing, if you let them be. I was assigned a 90-second speaking slot in the most important session of my career. I used every second of it. I did not use it efficiently, by any political measure. I did not make a legal argument. I did not cite precedent. I talked about rivers and music and the ordinary stubbornness of people who rebuild after disasters. It did not change the vote. Nothing would have changed that vote. But it changed something. I know it did, because of what came later. Because Sarith stopped me at the door. Because the Kiriti ambassador laughed in the chamber 9 years later. Because a young Veth commander sat across from me with a cup of tea and said, "You did not use the back door." And then listened very carefully to my answer. 90 seconds. Say what is true. Say what is real. Then go home and get to work. That is all I did. That is what changed everything. You are going to be all right. Not because the galaxy is kind, it is often not. Not because the road is clear, it never is. Because you are the kind of people who get angry about the right things and then build something from that anger. Because when the room goes quiet and everyone looks at you, you look back. Because you have read the history and you know that the 72-hour clock is not a deadline. It is a starting gun. Go. Build something. Make them glad they let you back in. And if they are slow to be glad about it, that is fine too. You have time. We always do.